My son looked me straight in the eyes and chose his wealthy father-in-law over me. In front of an entire room filled with crystal chandeliers and expensive suits, Ethan Matthews said the words I never thought I would hear. Richard has done more for my future than anyone else. Anyone else? Not his mother, not the woman who raised him alone after his father died. The room fell silent as I stood there trying not to cry. Then the doors opened, and a gray-haired attorney walked inside carrying a leather briefcase. What happened next would change every life in that room forever. If this story touches your heart, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. And before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Stories like this remind us we're never alone in our struggles. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done if your own child chose money over family? Leave a comment below. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always enjoy reading every message. People often assume that the deepest heartbreak comes from losing a spouse. I used to believe that too. Then I watched my own son slowly become a stranger. My name is Brenda Matthews. And at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be telling this story. For most of my life, I wasn't anyone special. I wasn't a celebrity. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't powerful. I was simply a mother. And for many years, that was enough. When my husband, Thomas Matthews, died, Ethan was only 10 years old. I still remember the day I had to tell him. The memory has never left me. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Thomas had been fighting an aggressive illness for nearly a year. We had both tried to shield Ethan from the worst of it, but children always know more than we think. When the doctor finally walked out and shook his head, I felt the world collapse beneath my feet. I sat beside Thomas's bed and held his hand long after the machines had gone silent. Then I went home and faced the hardest conversation of my life. Ethan was sitting on the living room floor, building something with old toy cars. He looked up and smiled. Did Dad say when he's coming home? I can still hear those words. Even now, more than 25 years later, I sat beside him and wrapped my arms around his shoulders. When I told him his father was gone, he stared at me for several seconds without speaking. Then he broke down. I had never seen pain like that in a child. That night, he cried himself to sleep in my bed. I stayed awake until sunrise, not because I couldn't sleep, because I was terrified. Terrified of raising a little boy alone. Terrified of failing him. Terrified of not being enough. But life doesn't wait for us to recover. The bills kept arriving. The mortgage still needed to be paid. The groceries still needed to be bought. And Ethan still needed a parent. So I got up and kept moving. For years, I worked every job I could find. In the mornings, I worked as a receptionist at a medical office. In the evenings, I waited tables at a local restaurant. On weekends, I sometimes helped with bookkeeping for a small business owner in town. There were weeks when I barely slept. Weeks when I survived on coffee and determination. I remember standing in grocery stores with a calculator, carefully adding every item before putting it in the cart. I remember skipping meals so Ethan could have the foods he liked. I remember wearing the same winter coat for nearly 10 years because replacing it wasn't in the budget. But I never regretted any of it. Not once. Because every sacrifice felt worthwhile when I looked at my son. Ethan was a good kid. A truly good kid. He was kind, respectful, hardworking. Whenever he saw me come home exhausted, he would help without being asked. He washed dishes, folded laundry, mowed lawns for neighbors to earn extra money. And every Mother's Day, he made me a handmade card. I still have every single one. One of them sits in a drawer beside my bed. He wrote it when he was 12. The handwriting is crooked and uneven. At the bottom, he wrote, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know." For years, whenever life became difficult, I would read those words. They reminded me why I kept going. As Ethan grew older, he became even more determined. He excelled in school. His teachers loved him. His classmates respected him. By the time he graduated high school, he had earned a scholarship to a respected university. I was so proud that day I could barely stop crying. I remember sitting in the audience during graduation. When they called his name, I stood and applauded until my hands hurt. The woman sitting beside me laughed and said, "I think everyone knows that's your son." I smiled and answered, "That's because he's my greatest achievement." And I meant it. Nothing I had ever done mattered more than raising Ethan. Not my career, not my savings, not anything else, just him. After graduation, life finally seemed to be improving. Ethan left for college. I continued working. The financial pressure eased slightly. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future. Friends encouraged me to start dating again. Some even tried setting me up with nice men they knew. I always declined. Not because I was unhappy, but because my priorities had always been clear. My focus was Ethan. Looking back now, maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I spent so much time building my son's future that I forgot to build my own. But at the time, it felt like the right choice. Every phone call from Ethan made me smile. Every visit home filled the house with laughter. He called me his best friend. He asked for my advice about classes, about internships, about life. We talked about everything, or at least we used to. The first real change happened during his junior year of college. It was subtle. So subtle that I almost missed it. Our phone calls became shorter. The conversations felt different. He started talking more about networking, status, and opportunities. Words that had never interested him before suddenly became important. At first, I assumed it was normal. College changes people. Growing up changes people. I didn't think much of it. Then one evening, he called and mentioned a young woman named Olivia. The way he talked about her made me smile. I could hear excitement in his voice. Hope. Possibility. I remember sitting in my kitchen listening to him describe her. "Mom, she's smart. Really smart." "That's wonderful," I said. "And her family owns several businesses." I noticed how quickly he added that detail. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now I know it wasn't. Over the following months, Olivia's name appeared in nearly every conversation. Ethan sounded happy, and that was all I cared about. If she made him happy, I wanted to meet her. I wanted to welcome her into our family. I had no idea that meeting Olivia would also mean meeting the people who would eventually come between my son and me. I had no idea that a man named Richard Whitmore was about to enter our lives. And I certainly had no idea that buried beneath decades of silence was a secret connected to my late husband, Thomas. A secret powerful enough to destroy reputations. A secret that would eventually force my son to choose between wealth and family. And when that moment came, the choice he made would break my heart. But that part of the story was still ahead of us. At the time, I was simply a proud mother waiting to meet the woman her son loved. I believed the hardest years were behind me. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first time I met Olivia Whitmore, I understood immediately why Ethan had fallen in love with her. She was beautiful, confident, and intelligent. The kind of young woman who could walk into a room and instantly make people pay attention. She had long blonde hair, a bright smile, and a calm confidence that made her seem older than her years. When Ethan brought her to my house for dinner, she arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. That simple gesture won me over immediately. "I didn't know what you liked," she said with a nervous smile. "So I made the recipe my grandmother taught me." I remember laughing. "Then you're already family." That evening felt wonderful. The three of us sat around my small dining table for nearly 3 hours. We talked about college, future plans, favorite books, travel dreams. Everything felt natural, comfortable. By the end of the night, I hugged Olivia goodbye and whispered to Ethan after she left, "She's a keeper." He grinned like a teenager. That's exactly what I think. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The relationship grew stronger. Olivia visited often. Sometimes she even called me just to chat. I genuinely liked her. And more importantly, she seemed to genuinely love Ethan. At least that's what I believed. Then, a few months later, Ethan asked me a question that changed everything. "Mom, would you like to meet Olivia's parents?" I smiled. Of course. The excitement in his voice should have made me happy. Instead, for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt uneasy. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something else. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling. 2 weeks later, I met Richard Whitmore, and from the very first moment, I knew he didn't like me. The dinner took place at an upscale country club outside Columbus. The kind of place where the membership fees alone probably cost more than my first car. I remember feeling slightly out of place when I walked inside. The lobby featured marble floors, crystal chandeliers, paintings worth more than my house. Everything seemed designed to remind visitors how wealthy the members were. When Ethan introduced us, Richard shook my hand. Technically, his fingers barely touched mine. His smile never reached his eyes. "Brenda," he said, "not Mrs. Matthews. Not nice to finally meet you. Just Brenda, as if my name itself required no respect." His wife, Margaret Whitmore, was friendlier, or at least she appeared to be. She smiled constantly, complimented my outfit, asked polite questions. Oh. But there was something rehearsed about it, something artificial. Every sentence felt carefully calculated. The entire evening felt strange. Whenever I spoke, Richard seemed uninterested. Whenever Ethan spoke, Richard paid close attention, particularly when the conversation involved business. I quickly learned that Richard owned several companies throughout Ohio: commercial real estate, construction, investment firms. His wealth was substantial, and he clearly enjoyed reminding people of it. Every story somehow returned to his success. Every conversation eventually became about money, or influence, or status. At one point, he pointed toward a photograph hanging on the wall. The picture showed him standing beside a governor. "I've spent years building relationships with important people," he said. Then he looked directly at Ethan. "Success isn't just about talent. It's about knowing the right people." Ethan nodded, almost admiringly. I noticed it immediately, and I didn't like it. The son I had raised was ambitious, but he had never been impressed by wealth. Never. Yet during that dinner, I saw something changing, something subtle, something dangerous. Richard had a way of making money seem like the measure of a person's value. And Ethan was listening. Over the next year, the Whitmore family became increasingly involved in Ethan's life. Olivia graduated. Ethan graduated. They got engaged shortly afterward. I was thrilled for them. But I also noticed that Ethan was spending more and more time with Richard. Golf outings, business dinners, networking events, private meetings. Richard treated Ethan like a future investment, a project, a young man he could shape into exactly what he wanted. And Ethan seemed eager for the attention. One afternoon, I invited Ethan to lunch. We met at a small diner we had visited for years. The same place where I used to take him after Little League games. The same place where we'd celebrated scholarships and birthdays. As we sat in our usual booth, I noticed he spent most of the meal checking his phone. Something he never used to do. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me. "Are you happy?" He looked surprised. "Of course." "You seem different lately," he laughed. "Mom, people grow. I know. You don't have to worry about me." The words sounded harmless, but there was a distance behind them. A wall. For the first time in my life, I felt like I couldn't fully reach my son. The wedding planning moved quickly. The Whitmores insisted on paying for everything. The venue, the catering, the decorations, everything. I offered to contribute. Richard refused immediately. "That's unnecessary." The way he said it felt less like kindness and more like dismissal. As if he couldn't imagine I had anything meaningful to offer. I tried to ignore it. For Ethan's sake. But the warning signs kept appearing. Small things. Tiny moments. Moments that didn't seem important at first. One evening during a family gathering, I overheard Richard speaking to several guests. They were discussing Ethan. He has potential, Richard said. Potential? Someone asked. Absolutely. The boy just needed the right environment. The boy? Not Ethan. Not my future son-in-law. The boy, then someone asked a question. What about his family? Richard chuckled softly. I suppose every success story starts somewhere. The group laughed. Quietly. Politely. But they laughed. I stood frozen in the hallway. For a moment, I considered walking away. Instead, I listened. One of the guests asked where Ethan's father had worked. Richard answered before anyone else could. I don't remember exactly. A strange expression crossed his face. Only for a second, but I noticed it. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, not uncertainty. Recognition. The reaction was so brief that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Almost. But later that night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Richard knew something. I didn't know what, but I was certain of it. Because when Thomas's name had been mentioned, Richard's expression had changed completely. The next morning, I opened an old photo album. Page after page showed memories from another life. Family vacations, school events, birthdays, anniversaries. Then I found a picture of Thomas standing beside two other men at a business event nearly 30 years earlier. I stared at the image. My heart slowly began to race. One of those men looked familiar. Older now. Heavier now, but unmistakable. It was Richard Whitmore. I sat there for a long time staring at the photograph. Confused. Thomas had never mentioned being friends with Richard. Not once. Not in all our years together. And yet there they were, standing side by side, smiling, as if they knew each other well. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why had Richard pretended not to know my husband? Why had he acted unfamiliar when we first met? And most importantly, what exactly was he hiding at the time? I had no idea those questions would eventually unravel everything. I still believed the biggest challenge ahead was adjusting to my son's new life. I didn't yet realize that the past was quietly preparing to return. And when it did, it would expose secrets that had been buried for decades. Secrets connected to Thomas. Secrets connected to Richard. And secrets that would eventually force Ethan to make a choice that would break my heart. A few months after discovering that old photograph of Thomas and Richard together, I received an invitation from the Whitmores. It was for a family dinner at their estate. Not their house. Their estate. That was the word printed on the elegant invitation card. The Whitmores seemed to enjoy reminding everyone how wealthy they were. By then, Ethan and Olivia had already set a wedding date. The engagement had become the center of everyone's lives. Every conversation revolved around venues, guest lists, floral arrangements, and future plans. I tried my best to be supportive. I truly did. But something felt different now. The closer Ethan grew to the Whitmores, the farther away he seemed from me. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was simply struggling with the natural changes that happen when a child becomes an adult. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. The evening of the dinner arrived on a cool autumn Saturday. I drove nearly 40 minutes to reach the Whitmore property. The moment the gates opened, I felt as if I had entered another world. The driveway stretched through acres of perfectly maintained land. Fountains sparkled beneath carefully placed lights. Luxury vehicles lined the circular entrance. The house itself looked more like a private resort than a family home. As I parked my modest sedan among a row of expensive cars, I suddenly felt self-conscious. I hated that feeling. I had spent my entire life teaching Ethan that a person's value wasn't measured by money. Yet somehow, standing there, I felt judged before I even stepped inside. A valet opened my door. "Welcome, ma'am." I thanked him and walked toward the entrance. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, paintings that probably cost more than my annual income. Guests filled the rooms. Business executives, local politicians, wealthy investors, people who all seemed to know Richard Whitmore, and people who all seemed impressed by him. I quickly spotted Ethan. The moment I saw him, my heart softened. No matter what had changed between us, he was still my son. Still the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. He smiled when he noticed me. "Mom, you made it." I hugged him. Of course I did. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then Richard appeared. Brenda, there was that tone again. Polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. "Richard," he nodded. "Glad you could join us." The words sounded more like an obligation than genuine hospitality. Before I could respond, he turned his attention elsewhere. A wealthy donor had entered the room. Apparently, that person mattered more. The evening continued. Guests mingled. Servers carried trays of expensive appetizers. Conversations centered around investments and business opportunities. I tried participating when I could. Most people barely acknowledged me. A few smiled politely. Others seemed to lose interest the moment they learned I wasn't part of their social circle. I wasn't surprised. What hurt was watching Ethan slowly adapt to that environment. He laughed at jokes he wouldn't have found funny years ago. He nodded eagerly when wealthy men offered advice. He seemed determined to prove he belonged there. As dinner approached, everyone moved toward an enormous dining room. The table stretched nearly the length of the room. At least 20 people would be seated. Place cards had been arranged carefully. I searched for mine. Then I found it. Near the far end of the table, almost as far away from Ethan and Olivia as possible. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Then I noticed where Richard had seated himself. At the center, naturally, Ethan sat beside Olivia, directly next to Richard. The important people occupied the middle section. The less important guests occupied the edges, and I had been placed near the very end. The message couldn't have been clearer. I sat down quietly. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. Then dinner began. Within 15 minutes, Richard removed any doubt. The conversation turned toward education. One guest mentioned his son's acceptance into a prestigious business program. Another spoke proudly about a daughter attending law school. Eventually, someone asked Ethan about his upbringing. Before Ethan could answer, Richard spoke. Ethan's success is remarkable. Several guests nodded. Richard smiled. Considering how modest his beginnings were, the table laughed softly. I felt my stomach tighten. Modest beginnings. What a pleasant way to describe years of struggle. Years of sacrifice. Years spent working myself nearly to exhaustion so Ethan could have opportunities. I glanced toward my son. Surely he would say something. Surely he would defend me. He didn't. Instead, he smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. That hurt more than Richard's comment. Much more. As the evening continued, the small insults accumulated, one after another. Richard referred to business success as something that separated winners from ordinary people. Margaret spoke about exclusive social circles. Several guests discussed vacation homes and private clubs. Every topic seemed designed to remind people where they ranked, and where I ranked, near the bottom. At one point, a woman across from me asked what I did before retirement. I worked several jobs while raising my son. She smiled politely. How admirable. The way she said it sounded less like respect and more like pity. I suddenly felt exhausted. Emotionally exhausted. I excused myself and left the table for a few minutes. I needed air. I wandered down a hallway searching for a restroom. As I turned a corner, I heard voices coming from a nearby study. The door wasn't fully closed. I recognized Richard immediately. Then I heard Ethan. I froze. Instinct told me to walk away. Instead, I stood there, listening. I just want everything to go smoothly, Ethan said. It will, Richard replied. Assuming unnecessary complications don't arise. A pause followed. Then Ethan sighed. My mother means well, Richard chuckled. That isn't always enough. Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence I would never forget. The sentence that echoed in my mind for months afterward. Ethan laughed softly and said, Honestly, sometimes she embarrasses me around people like this. I felt as though someone had punched me in the chest. The world seemed to stop. I waited for him to correct himself. To explain? To soften the statement. Instead, he continued, she just doesn't understand how things work at this level. Richard laughed. And Ethan laughed with him. I couldn't breathe. My son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, the child who once called me the strongest person he knew. The same child now discussing me as though I were a burden, an inconvenience, an embarrassment. I backed away from the door before either of them could see me. Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not there. Not in that house. Not where Richard Whitmore could enjoy seeing my pain. I walked outside and stood beneath the cold night sky. For several minutes, I simply stared into the darkness. trying to steady myself, trying to understand how everything had changed so dramatically. Then, another thought entered my mind. Something Richard had said during that conversation. Unnecessary complications. The phrase bothered me, because it sounded less like a comment about me and more like a warning, as though there was something happening behind the scenes, something I wasn't supposed to know. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Ethan wasn't the only one hiding something from me. Richard Whitmore was hiding something too, something connected to my late husband, something connected to that old photograph. And whatever it was important enough to make him nervous. I didn't know it yet. But I was standing at the edge of a truth that would soon change all of our lives. I barely slept after the dinner at the Whitmore estate. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan's voice again. Sometimes she embarrasses me around people like this. The words repeated endlessly in my mind, over and over, like a wound that refused to stop bleeding. For several days, I tried to convince myself there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe I had taken the comment out of context. Maybe Ethan was under pressure. Maybe he hadn't meant what it sounded like. Mothers are experts at making excuses for their children, especially when the truth hurts. But deep down, I knew exactly what I had heard. And I knew exactly how it had made me feel. The following weeks brought little comfort. If anything, the distance between Ethan and me became even more noticeable. Our phone calls grew shorter. His visits became less frequent. Whenever I tried discussing something personal, he quickly redirected the conversation. Toward work, toward Olivia, toward opportunities, toward the future. Always the future, never the past, never family, never us. One afternoon, he invited me to lunch. The invitation surprised me. Part of me hoped he wanted to talk about what had happened at the Whitmore estate. Maybe he had realized how much he was changing. Maybe he wanted to reconnect. I arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early. It was a modern steakhouse downtown, far more expensive than the places we used to visit together. When Ethan arrived, he looked distracted. His phone buzzed constantly. Several times during the meal, he glanced at incoming messages. Finally, I decided to speak honestly. Ethan, he looked up. Yeah, Mom, I need to ask you something. His expression immediately became cautious. What is it? I took a deep breath. Are you happy? He frowned. Why do you keep asking me that? Because lately, you don't seem like yourself. His shoulders tightened. I've changed. Everyone changes. Then what's the problem? The frustration in his voice caught me off guard. I stared at him. For a moment, I saw a stranger sitting across from me. Not the boy I had raised. Not the young man who once told me everything. Someone else. Someone harder. More guarded. I just miss you, I said quietly. Something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps. Or maybe irritation. It vanished quickly. I'm busy. Mom, I understand that. Do you? His tone sharpened. I finally have opportunities. Real opportunities. I remained silent. He leaned back in his chair. Richard has introduced me to people who can change my entire career. There it was again. Richard. Every conversation seemed to return to him. Every path somehow led back to Richard Whitmore. I forced a smile. I'm glad things are going well. They are. But he didn't sound happy. He sounded defensive, as though he needed constant reassurance that his choices were correct. The conversation never recovered. When lunch ended, he hugged me briefly before leaving. The embrace felt rushed, formal, nothing like the hugs we used to share. I sat in the restaurant long after he left, wondering where my son had gone. 2 weeks later, I got my answer, or at least part of it. The Whitmores hosted another gathering. This one was smaller, more private. Only close family members attended. Olivia invited me personally. I almost declined. Something told me I should stay home. But I loved my son, and I wanted to support him. So I went. The evening started pleasantly enough. Dinner was served. Wine flowed freely. Everyone appeared relaxed. Then Richard asked Ethan to join him in his study. The request seemed casual, but something about Richard's tone caught my attention. About 20 minutes passed. Neither man returned. I excused myself from the table and headed toward the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. At least that's what I told myself. But as I approached the study, I heard raised voices, and then I heard my name. I stopped immediately. The door was slightly open. Inside, Richard stood near his desk. Ethan sat across from him. Several documents lay between them. "I need to know you're committed," Richard was saying. "I am completely committed." "I said I am." Richard folded his arms. "No distractions." My stomach tightened. Then Richard spoke words that changed everything. "If you're going to become part of this family, you need to think like part of this family." Ethan nodded. "I do," Richard continued. "That means understanding priorities." A long silence followed. Then came the sentence I would never forget. The future we're offering you can't be limited by obligations that no longer serve a purpose." I felt sick. Ethan stared at the documents. "What exactly are you asking?" Richard sat down slowly. "I'm asking whether you're prepared to put your future first." Another pause. Then Richard said it, clearly, directly, without hesitation. "Between your mother and this opportunity, which one matters more?" The room became silent. Even from the hallway, I could feel the weight of the question. My heart pounded. Part of me already knew the answer, but I still hoped. I still prayed. I still believed the son I raised was somewhere inside that room, waiting to stand up, waiting to defend his mother, waiting to say no. Instead, Ethan lowered his eyes. Then he said something that shattered whatever hope remained. "I'm building a future with Olivia," Richard smiled. "Good answer." I closed my eyes. The pain was immediate, sharp, almost physical. I wanted to walk into the room. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to ask how the little boy who once cried himself to sleep after losing his father could become this man. But I didn't. I simply stood there, listening. Richard slid the documents across the desk. Ethan, this is what successful people do. What? They make difficult choices. My son picked up a pen. I couldn't see the paperwork clearly, but I watched him sign something. Page after page. Then Richard stood and extended his hand. Ethan shook it. The gesture felt less like family and more like a business transaction, an agreement, a bargain, one that somehow included sacrificing me. I quietly stepped away before either man could discover I had been there. My legs felt weak. My chest ached. For several minutes, I sat alone on a bench outside the house. The cold night air stung my face, but it couldn't numb the pain. Eventually, Ethan came looking for me. There you are, I forced a smile. Just needed some fresh air. You okay? The question almost made me laugh. Okay, no, I wasn't okay, but I wasn't ready to confront him either, so I nodded. I'm fine. He seemed relieved. Too relieved, as if he wanted to believe that everything remained normal. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely remember the drive home. I barely remember walking through my front door. What I do remember is standing in my living room staring at a photograph of Thomas. The same photograph I had looked at hundreds of times over the years. For a long while. I simply stood there. Then I spoke aloud. Your son chose them. The words echoed through the empty house. And somehow saying them made the reality impossible to deny. Ethan had made his choice. Not accidentally. Not under pressure. Not by mistake. He had chosen. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I opened an old address book. Most of the numbers inside were outdated. Some people had moved away. Some had passed on. But one name remained. Daniel Coleman. The attorney who had worked with Thomas years ago. The attorney who still occasionally sent me holiday cards. I stared at the number for several seconds. Then I picked up the phone. When Daniel answered, I spoke only one sentence. Daniel, I think it's finally time. There was a long silence on the other end. Then he replied quietly, I've been wondering when you'd call. I met Daniel Coleman 3 days later. His office sat inside an older brick building in downtown Columbus. The place hadn't changed much in the 25 years since I had last visited. The same brass directory in the lobby. The same polished wooden staircase. The same quiet atmosphere that somehow made every conversation feel important. As I stepped into the reception area, I suddenly felt nervous. Not because of Daniel. Because of what reopening the past might uncover. Some doors remained closed for a reason. And I was about to open one that had been locked for decades. Daniel greeted me personally. He was in his 70s now. His hair had turned completely white. His posture had become slightly stooped. But his eyes remained sharp. Very sharp. When he saw me, his expression softened. Brenda. Daniel. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Time seemed to disappear. We were suddenly standing 25 years in the past. Back when Thomas was still alive. Back before everything changed. Finally, Daniel gestured toward his office. Come in. I followed him inside. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Legal files lined the shelves. Photographs covered one wall. Several included Thomas. Seeing them unexpectedly caught me off guard. Daniel noticed. He was a good man. I smiled sadly. The best? Daniel nodded. I agree. We sat down. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel leaned forward. Are you sure you're ready? The question lingered between us. Ready. Was I ready? The honest answer was no. I wasn't ready to discover what Thomas had hidden. I wasn't ready to learn why Richard Whitmore had pretended not to know him. I wasn't ready to confront the possibility that my entire understanding of the past was incomplete. But I was ready for one thing. The truth, whatever it cost. Yes, I said. Daniel studied me carefully. Then he stood and walked toward a locked filing cabinet. From inside, he removed a thick file folder. Its edges had yellowed with age. Dust clung to the corners. Clearly, it hadn't been opened in years. My heart immediately began racing. Daniel placed the file on his desk. Then he rested one hand on top of it. Thomas instructed me to keep these documents secure. I swallowed hard. Why? He believed one day they might become important. The room suddenly felt smaller. What exactly is in there? Daniel took a deep breath. That's a complicated answer. He opened the folder. Inside were dozens of documents. Contracts, financial statements, letters, business records. Some were so old the paper had become brittle. I stared at them in confusion. None of it made sense. Thomas had never been a wealthy businessman. At least not that I knew of. He had worked long hours. He had provided for our family. But we had never lived extravagantly. Never. Daniel selected one document and slid it across the desk. Do you recognize this company name? I looked down. My eyes widened. The name felt strangely familiar. Not because I had seen it recently, because I had heard Thomas mention it years ago. Very briefly, very casually, back when Ethan was still a child. I think so. Daniel nodded. Thomas helped start this company. I stared at him. What? He was one of the original founders. For several seconds I couldn't speak. That made no sense. Absolutely none. If Thomas had founded a successful company, why had we struggled financially after his death? Why had I spent years working multiple jobs? Why had he never told me Daniel seemed to anticipate my confusion? Brenda, Thomas sold most of his public interest before he became ill. I frowned. Then why are we discussing this? Daniel pulled another document from the folder. Because he didn't sell everything. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at him, then back at the documents, then back at him again. What are you saying? Daniel slid several pages toward me. Thomas retained a significant ownership position through a private structure. I stared at the paperwork. The legal language blurred together. My pulse pounded in my ears. How significant? Daniel hesitated, then answered. Very significant. The room became silent. Outside the office window, traffic continued moving through downtown Columbus. People walked the sidewalks. Cars passed by. The world continued normally. Meanwhile, my entire reality was shifting. Slowly, relentlessly. Why didn't he tell me? Daniel's expression softened. Because he was dying, I looked away. The pain of that truth never faded. Not even after all these years. Daniel continued. Thomas believed there would be time. I closed my eyes. Time. The one thing nobody controls. He intended to explain everything after certain legal matters were finalized. What legal matters? Daniel hesitated again. That hesitation immediately caught my attention. What aren't you telling me? He looked directly at me. Richard Whitmore. The name sent a chill through my body. Suddenly, everything felt connected. The photograph, the strange reactions, the lies, everything. What about Richard? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Richard and Thomas weren't simply acquaintances. My stomach tightened. They were business partners. I stared at him. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Business partners. Thomas had never mentioned that. Not once. Not in all our years together. Daniel continued carefully. Several early projects involved both men. Then why did Richard pretend not to know him? Daniel's face darkened. That's a question I've been asking myself for years. The silence that followed felt heavy. Dangerous. I suddenly realized this wasn't merely about money. It was about something much bigger. Something someone wanted forgotten. Daniel opened another section of the file. Inside were copies of letters. Many written by Thomas. Several addressed directly to Richard. I picked one up. My hands trembled slightly. The letter discussed ownership interests, future investments, partnership agreements. The date shocked me. It had been written only months before Thomas became ill. I looked up. If they were partners. What happened? Daniel sighed. After Thomas's diagnosis, communication changed. How? Richard became increasingly aggressive. The words immediately alarmed me. Daniel continued. There were disputes. About money. Partly. His expression grew serious. There were disagreements about control. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The deeper we went, the worse this sounded. Did Thomas trust Richard? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a sealed envelope hidden inside the folder. The envelope was addressed in Thomas's handwriting. My breath caught. I recognized it instantly. I had seen that handwriting thousands of times. Birthday cards, anniversary notes, grocery lists, love letters. For a moment, it felt as if he were in the room. Daniel carefully removed a single page. Then handed it to me. At the bottom, I saw Thomas's signature. Near the center, one sentence had been underlined. I read it twice. Then a third time, my heart stopped. If anything happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore. The words seemed impossible, yet they sat there in black ink, written by my husband. Years before his death. Years before Ethan met Olivia. Years before the Whitmores entered our lives. I looked up slowly. Daniel's face revealed everything. He had known. All these years, he had known something wasn't right. And now, for the first time, I was beginning to understand why. The room felt colder. The stakes suddenly felt larger, much larger. Because this was no longer simply about a son choosing his wealthy father-in-law. This was about a secret buried for decades. A secret connected to Thomas. A secret connected to Richard. And a secret powerful enough that my dying husband had felt compelled to leave behind a warning. As I stared at those words, one realization became impossible to ignore. Richard Whitmore had spent years pretending the past didn't exist. And people only work that hard to hide something when the truth can destroy them. For nearly 2 weeks after my meeting with Daniel Coleman, I told no one what I had learned. Not Ethan. Not Olivia. Not even my closest friends. I carried the information alone, like a heavy stone in my chest. Every morning, I woke up thinking about Thomas's letter. Every night I reread the copy Daniel had given me. The same sentence haunted me. If anything happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding, something innocent hidden beneath decades of secrecy. But deep down, I knew better. Thomas had never been careless with words. If he had written that warning, he had a reason, a very serious reason. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his investigation. Old files were retrieved. Corporate records were examined. Former business associates were contacted. The deeper he looked, the more concerned he became. He didn't tell me everything immediately, but I could see it in his face. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then Ethan called. "Mom, I need a favor." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. The sudden change immediately made me suspicious. "What kind of favor?" "We'd love for you to attend a charity gala next month." I frowned. "A charity gala? Yeah." "Why me?" He laughed. "Because you're family." The answer sounded rehearsed, not genuine. Still, I agreed, partly because I wanted to support him, partly because I wanted to observe the Whitmores more closely, and partly because Daniel had recently uncovered something interesting. The gala was being organized by one of Richard's foundations, a foundation connected to several of the companies Daniel was investigating. I didn't know exactly what that meant yet. But I intended to find out. The event took place at one of the most expensive hotels in Columbus. The ballroom looked like something from a movie. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings. Live musicians played near the stage. Hundreds of guests filled the room. Many were wealthy business owners. Others were politicians and donors. Everywhere I looked, people wore designer clothing and expensive jewelry. I arrived alone. The moment I entered, I spotted Ethan and Olivia greeting guests near the entrance. Both looked elegant, successful, perfect, at least on the surface. Ethan smiled when he saw me. "You look great. Mom!" "Thank you." Olivia hugged me warmly. "It's so good you came." I smiled. I wouldn't miss it. For a brief moment, everything felt normal. Then Richard approached. His smile appeared instantly. the kind of smile he used whenever important people were watching. Brenda. There was that familiar tone again. Pleasant, controlled, artificial. Richard. He gestured toward several guests standing nearby. Come meet some friends. Before I could respond, he was already guiding me toward a group of wealthy donors. At first, the introduction seemed harmless. Then Richard began speaking. This is Brenda Matthews. Everyone smiled politely. Richard continued. She's Ethan's mother. More polite smiles. Then he added something unnecessary. Something deliberate. Brenda spent most of her life in a small town just outside Columbus. A few guests nodded. She worked several jobs while raising Ethan. Again, polite smiles. But I recognized what Richard was doing. He wasn't introducing me. He was defining me, reducing my entire life to a humble background story. A supporting character in Ethan's success. One donor laughed. Well, you certainly produced an ambitious son. Richard smiled. Fortunately, Ethan has expanded beyond his beginnings. Several people chuckled. I felt my stomach tighten. The insult was subtle, carefully disguised as a compliment, exactly the way Richard preferred. I glanced toward Ethan. He heard it. I know he did. But once again, he said nothing. That silence hurt more than any insult. As the evening continued, the humiliation became increasingly obvious. Not dramatic, not loud, just constant. Small remarks, small dismissals. Small reminders that I didn't belong in their world. At one point, I joined a conversation about business leadership. The moment I offered an opinion, one executive politely redirected the discussion elsewhere. As though my perspective carried no value. Another woman asked where I had gone to college. When I explained that financial circumstances had prevented it, her interest vanished immediately. Everywhere I turned, I encountered the same attitude. People measured worth by wealth, status, influence, connections, everything except character. And Richard thrived in that environment. He moved through the ballroom like a king, shaking hands, accepting praise, enjoying every second of it. Then something unexpected happened. I was standing near one of the display tables when a voice behind me said, Brenda Matthews? I turned. A man in his 70s stood several feet away. Tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed. For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then his eyes widened. My God! I frowned. I'm sorry. The man stepped closer. You probably don't remember me. I studied his face. Something about him felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. He smiled. Victor Reynolds. The name struck me instantly. Thomas had mentioned Victor many times over the years. Business associate, friend, trusted colleague. Suddenly, I remembered. I had met him briefly decades ago. Victor! His smile grew wider. I can't believe it's you. We exchanged a quick hug. Then he looked genuinely shocked. What are you doing here? I laughed softly. My son was invited. Victor's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. Then he asked a strange question. Does Richard know you're here? I frowned. Of course. Victor stared at me, almost as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then his eyes drifted across the ballroom. Toward Richard. Toward Ethan. Toward Olivia. Finally, he looked back at me and said 4 words that changed everything. The original owner. I blinked. What? Victor repeated himself. The original owner. My pulse instantly quickened. The room suddenly felt quieter, smaller, more dangerous. I don't understand. Victor seemed surprised by my confusion. You mean nobody told you? Told me what? His expression darkened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he lowered his voice. Brenda, we need to talk. Every instinct inside me went on high alert. Before I could respond, another voice interrupted. Victor, Richard Whitmore had appeared. And for the first time since I met him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes, only for a second. But it was there. Victor noticed it too. The 2 men stared at each other, neither smiling, neither speaking. The tension between them was unmistakable. Finally, Richard forced a laugh. I didn't realize you 2 knew each other. Victor's response came immediately. Oh, we go back a very long way. The words carried meaning. The kind of meaning everyone in the room missed. Everyone except Richard. I watched a muscle tighten in Richard's jaw. For the first time. He looked uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Victor glanced toward me, then back toward Richard. And then he said something that made Richard visibly tense. Some histories are difficult to erase. The silence that followed felt electric, dangerous. Richard recovered quickly. He always did. But I had seen enough. Something connected these men. Something connected Thomas. Something connected me. And whatever that secret was, Victor clearly knew it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I barely heard the speeches, barely noticed the auction, barely paid attention to the guests, because my mind kept returning to Victor's words. The original owner. What did that mean? Owner of what? And why had Richard looked terrified when Victor said it as I left the ballroom that night? One thing became painfully clear. Daniel was right. The deeper we dug, the more nervous Richard became. And nervous people make mistakes. Sooner or later, Richard Whitmore was going to make one. And when he did, the truth he had spent decades hiding would finally come into the light. I met Victor Reynolds 3 days after the charity gala. He insisted on choosing the location. A quiet restaurant on the edge of town. No reporters, no business executives, no curious observers, just the 2 of us. The request alone told me this conversation was important. When I arrived, Victor was already waiting. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of him. He looked nervous. That surprised me. Victor Reynolds had spent decades in high-level business circles. Men like him usually projected confidence, control, authority. Yet that morning, he seemed uneasy, as though he had been carrying a burden for many years. When I sat down, he wasted no time. Thank you for coming. I needed answers. He nodded. I assumed you would. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me since the gala. What did you mean when you called me the original owner? Victor leaned back slowly. Then he released a long breath. The truth is complicated. So was everything Daniel showed me. His eyes narrowed slightly. You've been speaking with Daniel Coleman? Yes. Victor nodded. That seemed to confirm something for him. Then you're further along than I expected. I folded my hands together. Victor, stop talking around it. His expression softened. Fair enough. He reached into a leather folder and removed several photocopied documents. When he slid them across the table, my pulse immediately quickened. The company name was the same one Daniel had shown me. The same company Thomas had helped create decades earlier. The same company connected somehow to Richard Whitmore. Victor tapped the first page. This is where everything started. I looked down. The document listed 4 original founders: Thomas Matthews, Victor Reynolds, 2 others I didn't recognize, and Richard Whitmore. The sight of their names together sent a chill through me. Victor continued. Back then, none of us were wealthy. I listened carefully. We were ambitious. Thomas, especially. A faint smile appeared. He was brilliant. The compliment didn't surprise me. Thomas had always been intelligent, creative, forward-thinking. But hearing someone else say it still filled me with pride. Victor continued. Most people think Richard built his empire alone. His voice hardened. He didn't. I looked up. Victor met my eyes. Without Thomas, Richard never becomes Richard Whitmore. The words landed heavily. For years, Richard had acted as though he had created everything himself, built everything himself, earned everything himself. Now that image was beginning to crack. Victor opened another file. Inside were copies of old agreements, ownership structures, investment records. I didn't understand all the details, but one thing became obvious. Thomas's role had been much larger than I ever realized. Much larger. Why didn't he tell me? I asked quietly. Victor hesitated. Because your husband wasn't interested in showing off. I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Thomas. He believed family mattered more than money. Victor's expression darkened. Richard believed the opposite. The silence between us lasted several seconds. Then Victor said something that made my stomach tighten. The problems began when Thomas became sick. I immediately thought about the final year of Thomas's life. The endless doctor appointments, the treatments. The uncertainty. Victor nodded as if reading my thoughts. While Thomas was fighting for his life, Richard was fighting for control. I stared at him. What does that mean? Victor removed another document. This one appeared newer, more formal. After Thomas's diagnosis, several ownership structures were modified. I frowned. Modified, yes. Legally, Victor didn't answer immediately. That hesitation told me everything. My heart began pounding. Victor. He finally looked up. Not all of it. The room suddenly felt colder. What exactly are you saying? Victor leaned forward. I'm saying Richard benefited tremendously from Thomas's illness. I sat back in stunned silence. For years, I had believed fate was responsible for our struggles. Bad luck, tragedy, circumstances. Now another possibility was emerging, a much darker possibility. Victor continued carefully. Daniel has probably explained some of this already. Only pieces. Then let me fill in the rest. He opened another folder. Inside were copies of correspondence between Thomas and Richard. Many of the letters reflected growing tension, growing distrust, growing conflict. The friendly partnership visible in earlier documents had disappeared completely. One letter stood out immediately. I recognized Thomas's handwriting. My hands trembled as I read. The message was direct, blunt, uncharacteristically angry. Thomas accused Richard of violating prior agreements, of withholding information, of acting without authorization. I looked up. Thomas wrote this. Victor nodded. About 6 months before he died. The words hit me hard. Thomas rarely lost his temper. For him to write something like that, the situation must have been serious. Very serious. Victor folded his hands. Things became ugly near the end. What kind of ugly? The kind people spend decades trying to hide. The answer sent another chill through me. I looked back at the documents. The pieces were finally starting to connect. Slowly, painfully. But they were connecting. Then Victor said something even more shocking. Brenda, do you know why Richard looked terrified when he saw me at the gala? I shook my head. Because I know where the original ownership records are. The words seemed to hang in the air. Ownership records. My pulse immediately accelerated. What records? Victor smiled faintly. The records Richard hoped had disappeared. My heart nearly stopped. For years, decades, Richard had built an empire, a reputation, a legacy, and now Victor was telling me that the foundation beneath all of it might not belong entirely to Richard. I suddenly understood why Daniel had become so concerned, why Thomas had left warnings, why Richard reacted whenever the past resurfaced. The truth threatened everything. Victor opened one final folder. Inside sat copies of documents that looked remarkably different from the others. More official, more detailed, more important. He slid them toward me. These are copies. I looked down. The first page contained ownership percentages. My eyes widened. I read it again. Then a third time. Surely I was misunderstanding. But I wasn't. The numbers remained exactly the same. Thomas Matthews's ownership position was enormous, far larger than I ever imagined. Large enough to change everything. Large enough to explain why Richard had spent years pretending Thomas barely existed. Large enough to explain why Daniel had kept the records protected. And large enough to explain why Victor had called me the original owner. Because if these documents were genuine, then part of what Richard claimed as his empire never truly belonged to him. It belonged to Thomas. And after Thomas, it belonged to me. I stared at the paperwork in disbelief. How much? Victor gave a slow breath. A lot. That's not an answer, he nodded. No, it isn't. Then he finally said the words, enough that Richard would do almost anything to keep this quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The implications were overwhelming. My entire life, I had believed I was simply a widow who struggled after losing her husband. Now, I was learning that a completely different reality had existed behind the scenes. A reality hidden from me. A reality hidden from Ethan. A reality hidden from almost everyone. Victor's expression grew serious. Brenda, there's something else. I looked up. What? The moment Richard realizes Daniel is reopening these files, he's going to panic. I felt my stomach tighten. Panic? Victor nodded. People who've spent decades protecting a secret rarely surrender peacefully. The warning felt genuine. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Genuine. For the first time, I understood what we were really dealing with. This wasn't simply a family disagreement. This wasn't just a conflict between a mother and her son. This was a decades-old battle over truth, ownership, and betrayal. And Richard Whitmore knew the walls were beginning to close in. As I left the restaurant that afternoon, one thought followed me all the way home. For years, Richard had controlled the story. He had controlled the narrative. He had controlled what people believed, but now the evidence was resurfacing. The documents existed. The records existed. The witnesses existed. And sooner or later, Richard Whitmore would have to answer for all of it. A week after my meeting with Victor Reynolds, Ethan showed up at my house unexpectedly. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. My son looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His shoulders were tense. And there was an urgency in his expression that immediately put me on guard. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. "Of course." He entered the house and glanced around. The familiar living room hadn't changed much over the years. The same family photographs, the same furniture, the same framed Mother's Day cards he used to make when he was a child. For a brief moment, I wondered if he noticed them, if he remembered, but whatever thoughts crossed his mind disappeared quickly. Because he hadn't come here for memories. He had come for something else. Nah. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan finally broke the silence. "You've been meeting with Daniel Coleman." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. My stomach tightened. So Richard already knew, or suspected. I answered calmly. "Yes." Ethan immediately leaned forward. "Mom, what are you doing?" The frustration in his voice surprised me. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." I studied him carefully. The little boy I once knew seemed very far away. "I'm simply looking into some old matters involving your father." His jaw tightened. That's not what Richard says. There it was. Richard again. Always Richard. I took a slow breath. "And what exactly does Richard say?" Ethan hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "He says people are trying to stir up problems that should stay buried." The irony almost made me laugh. Problems that should stay buried. Interesting choice of words. Because innocent people rarely fear the truth? I see. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Mom, please. The word please sounded genuine, almost desperate. For a brief moment, I felt sympathy. Then I remembered the study, the signatures, the laughter, the choice he had already made. What is it you want from me? Ethan. His answer came immediately. Stop. I stared at him. Stop what? Whatever you're doing. The room became quiet. I looked at my son carefully, really looked at him. Not the successful professional, not Olivia's husband, not Richard's protege, just my son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed everything for. And suddenly I realized something painful. He wasn't here because he was worried about me. He was here because he was worried about himself. His future. His position. His opportunities. I asked the question softly. Are you afraid? His eyes widened. No, I waited. He looked away first. That was answer enough. Ethan. His gaze returned to mine. Why are you really here? The silence stretched. Then he finally spoke. Richard says this could damage a lot of people. I nodded slowly. And maybe some things are better left alone. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. Better left alone. Yes. I leaned back. So, if someone was wronged, we should ignore it. That's not what I'm saying. It sounds exactly like what you're saying. His frustration grew. Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be. The sentence hit me harder than he realized. Harder than he could possibly know. Because for decades, I had done the opposite. I had made life easier for him. I had worked extra jobs, skipped vacations, given up opportunities, sacrificed comfort, sacrificed sleep, sacrificed dreams, everything to make life easier for him. And now he was asking me to sacrifice the truth as well. For Richard, for money, for convenience. I folded my hands together. Tell me something honestly. He nodded cautiously. What? If your father were sitting here today, what would he tell us to do? The question caught him off guard. His eyes dropped toward the table. For a moment, he looked almost ashamed. Then the moment passed. That's not fair. Why not? Because Dad isn't here. No, he's not. The pain of that truth lingered between us. Then Ethan surprised me. Richard gave me opportunities Dad never could. The words landed like a slap. For several seconds, I simply stared at him, unable to believe what I had just heard. Slowly, I stood. My chair scraped against the floor. Ethan immediately realized he had crossed a line. Mom, I didn't mean. Yes, you did. His face paled. You meant every word. The room became silent. I walked toward the window. Outside, leaves drifted across the yard. The same yard where Ethan used to play baseball. The same yard where Thomas taught him how to ride a bicycle. The same yard where we built a life together. A life Ethan seemed increasingly eager to forget. When I turned back around, my voice was calm, calmer than I felt. "Do you know what your father gave you?" Ethan said nothing. "He gave you his name." Silence. "He gave you his values." Silence. "He gave you a family." Still silence. Then I said the one thing I knew Ethan needed to hear. "And he gave his life working to build something he believed would one day help you." The room seemed to freeze. I watched confusion flicker across his face. A brief moment of uncertainty. He had no idea what I meant. No idea what Daniel and Victor had uncovered. No idea how deeply connected his future was to the very father he seemed willing to dismiss. But I wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. Not yet. Ethan stood. His expression hardened. Whatever vulnerability had appeared moments earlier vanished. Richard's influence returned. The armor returned. The ambition returned. "Mom," I waited. He reached into his briefcase. Then he removed a document. My pulse immediately quickened. "What is that?" He placed it on the table. "Just a form." I stared at him. "What kind of form?" His answer chilled me. "A legal acknowledgement." I walked closer. The document contained several paragraphs. Most of it appeared routine, but one section immediately caught my attention. It involved future claims, future interests, future disputes. I looked up sharply. "Who gave you this?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We both knew. Richard. Of course. "What does this do?" Ethan crossed his arms. "It protects everyone." I almost laughed. "Protects everyone." Another carefully crafted phrase. "What does it actually do?" His voice became firmer. "It confirms you won't pursue any claims related to old business matters." There it was. The truth. Finally, Richard wasn't nervous. He was terrified. Terrified enough to send my own son carrying paperwork. Terrified enough to pressure Ethan into acting as his messenger. I stared at the document, then back at Ethan, for several long seconds. Finally, I asked one question. "If I sign this, who benefits?" Ethan didn't answer. His silence answered for him. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. And in that moment, I decided to give him one final chance. Maybe the last chance. The only chance. I pushed the document back across the table. Then I spoke carefully. "Ethan, listen to me." He waited. "If everything Richard has built is honest, he has nothing to fear." His expression tightened. "If the truth supports him, he wins." Still silence. "But if the truth doesn't support him..." I let the sentence hang. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. I continued. "Think carefully about the side you're choosing." The room became completely still. For a moment, I thought he might finally hear me, finally understand, finally remember who he was. Instead, he picked up the document, placed it back inside his briefcase, and stood. "I've already chosen." The words felt like a knife. Not because they surprised me, because they confirmed what I already knew. My son had chosen not family, not truth, not the father who built his future, not the mother who raised him. He had chosen Richard Whitmore. As Ethan walked toward the door, I felt an overwhelming sadness. But strangely, I also felt clarity. The waiting was over. The uncertainty was gone. The choice had been made. And now there would be consequences. When the door closed behind him, I remained standing in the silent kitchen. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Daniel. I answered immediately. His voice sounded urgent. "Brenda, what happened?" A brief pause followed. Then Daniel said the words that changed everything. "I think we're ready." 3 weeks after Ethan walked out of my house, Richard Whitmore organized what he called a family celebration. Officially, the event was meant to announce a major expansion of one of his companies. Unofficially, everyone knew it was about Ethan. Richard planned to introduce him as the future face of the business empire. The golden successor. The ambitious young executive who would carry the Whitmore legacy into the next generation. Invitations went out to investors, executives, board members, political donors, and members of the local press. It wasn't merely a family gathering. It was a public coronation. And Richard intended to enjoy every second of it. The event was held inside the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel downtown. The same hotel where the charity gala had taken place. The symbolism wasn't accidental. Richard liked stages. He liked audiences. He liked controlling the narrative. What he didn't realize was that the narrative was about to change. Completely. 3 days before the event, Daniel met me at his office one final time. When I arrived, every document was already organized, labeled, verified, prepared. Daniel looked exhausted, but he also looked satisfied. Like a man who had finally completed a puzzle decades in the making. "Everything has been confirmed," he said. I sat down slowly. "What exactly do we have?" Daniel opened a large binder. The evidence seemed endless. Original ownership agreements, partnership records, private correspondence, corporate restructuring documents, witness statements, letters written by Thomas, letters written by Richard, and most importantly, legally enforceable records showing the transfer of ownership rights after Thomas's death. My head spun as Daniel explained everything. For years, Richard had presented himself as the sole architect of his success. The visionary, the founder, the empire builder. The truth was very different. The original business structure had been built on the contributions of several people. But Thomas Matthews had held one of the largest ownership positions. And before his death, he had taken steps to protect those interests. Steps Richard apparently believed had disappeared forever. They hadn't. Daniel leaned forward. "Brenda, once this becomes public, there's no going back." I nodded. "I understand. Are you certain you want to do this?" The question deserved serious consideration. For a moment, I thought about Ethan, my son, the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, the teenager who once called me his hero, the young man who had somehow become willing to choose status over family. I still loved him. That would never change. But love and silence are not the same thing. And protecting someone from the consequences of their choices isn't always kindness. Sometimes it's weakness. I looked directly at Daniel. Yes, he nodded. Then he closed the binder. Then let's finish this. The night of the event arrived sooner than I expected. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for several minutes before leaving. Not because I was nervous about Richard, not because I was afraid of what might happen, because I was thinking about Thomas. I picked up the photograph that sat on my dresser. The same photograph I had looked at countless times over the years. His smile remained unchanged. Warm. Kind. Steady. I hope I'm doing the right thing, I whispered. Then I placed the photograph back down and left. When I arrived at the hotel, the ballroom was already crowded. Hundreds of guests filled the room. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement. Servers carried champagne. Photographers moved through the crowd. Business leaders exchanged handshakes. Everyone appeared eager to celebrate Richard Whitmore's latest triumph. No one realized they were about to witness his downfall. I spotted Ethan almost immediately. He stood beside Olivia near the stage. Both were dressed elegantly. Both looked confident, successful. But when Ethan noticed me entering the ballroom, something changed. The confidence disappeared for a moment. Concern replaced it. He walked toward me. "Mom," I smiled politely. "Ethan." His eyes searched my face, as though trying to determine whether I knew something. Perhaps part of him already suspected. "Thanks for coming." I was invited. The conversation felt awkward, strained. Nothing like the easy conversations we once shared. Before either of us could say more, Olivia approached. To her credit, she seemed genuinely pleased to see me. "Brenda," she hugged me warmly. For a brief moment, I felt sorry for her. Because unlike Ethan, she truly didn't understand what was happening. She still believed her father was an honorable man. She still believed the story Richard had spent years telling everyone. Soon that illusion would shatter. The lights dimmed. Guests began taking their seats. The presentation was about to begin. I noticed Daniel enter through a side doorway. He wasn't dressed like an attorney preparing for a legal battle. He looked like any other guest. Calm, professional, ordinary, which made him even more dangerous. Richard stepped onto the stage first. The applause was immediate, loud, enthusiastic, exactly what he expected. He smiled broadly, thanked everyone for attending, delivered a polished speech about leadership, vision, and success. Then he transitioned toward Ethan. "My family has always believed in investing in the future. More applause, more smiles, and more admiration." Richard extended his arm toward my son. "And tonight, I'm proud to introduce the next generation of leadership." Ethan stood. The crowd applauded again. Photographers raised their cameras. Richard looked delighted, victorious, certain. Then everything changed. A voice interrupted from the back of the ballroom. "Before you continue, Mr. Whitmore, there are several matters requiring immediate clarification." The room instantly fell silent. Every head turned. Daniel Coleman stood calmly near the entrance, holding a leather briefcase. For several seconds, nobody moved. Richard's smile disappeared. Completely. The transformation was remarkable. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely frightened. Not annoyed. Not irritated. Frightened. Ethan stared at Daniel in confusion. Olivia looked equally confused. Guests whispered among themselves. Richard recovered first. "What is this?" His voice sounded tight. Controlled. Dangerously controlled. Daniel walked forward. Slowly, deliberately, each step seemed to increase the tension inside the room. Finally, he stopped near the front. "I'm Daniel Coleman." Silence. "I represent the estate interests of Thomas Matthews." The name echoed through the ballroom. Thomas Matthews. My husband's name. Spoken publicly for the first time in years. I watched Richard's face carefully. The color drained from it. Daniel continued. "And I also represent Brenda Matthews." Every eye in the room turned toward me. The attention felt overwhelming, but I remained seated, calm, silent. Daniel opened his briefcase. Then he removed several folders. The same folders we had spent weeks preparing. The same evidence Richard had spent decades trying to bury. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded. Daniel ignored him. Instead, he addressed the audience. "For many years, certain facts regarding ownership interests and business succession have remained concealed." The room became completely still. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone sensed something significant was happening. Daniel held up a document. "This record establishes original ownership positions within the company's founding structure." He paused, then delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Contrary to public belief, Mr. Whitmore was never the sole controlling founder." A collective gasp moved through the crowd. Richard's expression hardened. Ethan looked stunned. Olivia stared at her father. Confused, alarmed, Daniel continued. "The largest surviving ownership interest does not belong to Richard Whitmore." He turned slightly and looked directly at me. Then he spoke the words that froze the entire room. "It belongs to Brenda Matthews." Silence. Absolute silence. Absolute. For several seconds, nobody seemed capable of breathing. Not Richard. Not Ethan. Not Olivia. Not the investors. Not the reporters. No one. Because in a single moment, the story Richard Whitmore had spent decades building had begun to collapse. And this was only the beginning. The silence inside the ballroom felt unreal. Hundreds of people sat frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the photographers seemed too stunned to lift their cameras. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap. After everything that had happened, I expected to feel triumphant, victorious, vindicated. Instead, I felt sad, deeply sad, because across the room sat my son. And the expression on Ethan's face was one I had never seen before. Shock. Pure shock. He stared at me as though he were seeing me for the first time. as though the woman he thought he knew had suddenly become a stranger. Daniel Coleman remained standing near the front of the ballroom, composed, professional, unshaken. Richard Whitmore, on the other hand, looked like a man watching his world collapse around him. His face had turned pale. The confident smile that usually never left him was gone. For the first time in decades, Richard no longer controlled the room. The truth did. Finally, Richard found his voice. "This is ridiculous." The words came out sharper than intended. Daniel calmly opened another folder. "Is it?" Richard pointed toward the documents. "Those records are incomplete." Daniel didn't react. "Incomplete?" "Yes." Richard straightened his jacket. His confidence was beginning to return, or at least he was trying to fake it. "There were numerous restructuring agreements over the years." Daniel nodded. "Correct. And those agreements superseded the original ownership arrangements." Daniel's expression remained unchanged. "No, they did not." A murmur spread through the crowd. Investors exchanged nervous glances. Board members whispered among themselves. Several reporters quickly began taking notes. Richard's jaw tightened. Then Daniel produced another document. A document I recognized immediately. Thomas's signature sat clearly at the bottom. This agreement specifically preserved the Matthews ownership interests. The room became even quieter. Daniel continued. "It was legally executed." Another document appeared. "Legally witnessed." Another. "Legally recorded." Then another. "And legally enforceable." Every sentence struck Richard like a hammer. I could see it happening, piece by piece. His defenses were crumbling. Still, he refused to surrender. "What exactly are you implying?" Richard demanded. Daniel looked directly at him. "I'm not implying anything." The attorney paused. "I'm stating facts." The room held its breath. Then Daniel delivered the next blow. For years, Thomas Matthews' ownership interests remained protected through private estate structures. He glanced toward me. Those interests transferred directly to Brenda Matthews upon Thomas's death. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Several people visibly turned toward me. I suddenly realized what they were thinking. For years, they had viewed me as a widow from a small town, a woman who didn't belong in their world, a woman Richard openly looked down upon. Now, they were discovering that much of what they admired about Richard's empire had been built with contributions from the very family he had dismissed. The irony was almost unbelievable. Ethan finally stood. His voice sounded strained. "Mom." The single word carried confusion, regret, fear. I looked at him quietly. He seemed desperate for answers. But Daniel wasn't finished, and neither was the truth. The attorney opened another folder. This one contained copies of correspondence between Thomas and Richard. Several guests leaned forward. Even Richard appeared uneasy. Daniel held up a letter. This was written 6 months before Thomas Matthews passed away. Then he began reading selected passages. Not every word. Only enough. Enough to establish a pattern of conflict, a pattern of distrust. a pattern showing that Thomas had become increasingly concerned about Richard's actions. Each excerpt made Richard look worse. Each page exposed another crack in the image he had spent years creating. Finally, Daniel stopped. Then he looked directly at the audience. What you're seeing tonight is not a misunderstanding. Silence. It is not confusion. More silence. And it is not ancient history. The room remained completely still. Daniel's next words landed like thunder. It is evidence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Olivia stood. Slowly. Her eyes never left her father. Dad, Richard looked toward her. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain. Dad, is any of this true? The question cut deeper than anything Daniel had said. Because it came from his daughter. Not an attorney, not an investor, not a rival. His daughter. Richard hesitated, only briefly, but everyone noticed. And in situations like this, hesitation is often more damaging than an answer. Olivia's expression changed immediately. She saw it too. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the crack. Dad, Richard finally spoke. Things are more complicated than they're making them sound. A weak response. Too weak. Even he seemed to realize it. Olivia stepped back. The disappointment on her face was heartbreaking. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because in many ways, she was another victim of Richard's lies. Then Daniel delivered the revelation that changed everything. He removed a final document from the folder. One I had seen during our preparation meetings. One I knew would have a devastating effect. This letter was written by Thomas Matthews. Richard immediately stiffened. Daniel continued. It was stored privately for decades. The room became silent once again. Then Daniel read the sentence aloud. If anything happens to me, do not trust Richard Whitmore. The impact was immediate. Audible gasps filled the ballroom. Several people actually turned toward Richard in disbelief. The sentence was simple, but devastating. Because it came from a man who had once trusted Richard enough to build a business with him. A man who had known him better than almost anyone. Richard's face turned red. That proves nothing. Daniel calmly folded the letter. Perhaps not by itself. Then he opened another folder. And that's why we didn't come with only one document. The audience shifted. Listening. Watching. Waiting. Daniel outlined additional records. Corporate decisions made during Thomas's illness and transactions that benefited Richard. Ownership changes that raised serious questions. Nothing was presented dramatically. Nothing was exaggerated. Facts spoke louder than emotion. And the facts were devastating. By the time Daniel finished, the room felt completely different. Richard was no longer the respected visionary standing at the center of the ballroom. He was a man surrounded by doubt. A man whose story no longer made sense. A man whose carefully constructed reputation had begun to unravel. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel closed the final folder and stepped back. The room remained silent. Everyone waited, expecting more. Instead, Daniel looked directly at me. Then he nodded. The gesture was small, but meaningful. He had finished. Now it was my turn. Slowly, I stood. Every eye in the ballroom followed me. I wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention. I never had been. For most of my life, I worked quietly, lived quietly, loved quietly. But tonight wasn't about attention. It was about truth. I looked around the room. Then I spoke. My husband never cared about being the richest man in the room. Silence. He cared about integrity. More silence. He believed success meant treating people with dignity. I glanced briefly toward Ethan. The pain in his eyes nearly broke my heart. But I continued. For years, I remained silent because I believed silence protected my family. The room listened carefully. I now understand that silence can also protect wrongdoing. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Then I delivered the truth I had carried for weeks. I didn't pursue this because I wanted revenge. I looked directly at Richard. I pursued it because the truth matters. For the first time all evening, Richard couldn't look me in the eye. That alone told everyone everything they needed to know. As I sat back down, the ballroom remained completely silent. The investors looked worried. The reporters looked energized. The board members looked frightened. Olivia looked devastated. And Ethan looked shattered. Because for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand exactly what he had chosen. And exactly who he had chosen against. The days following the ballroom confrontation felt surreal, Sasahis. For nearly 30 years, Richard Whitmore had controlled the story. Then, in a single evening, that story began falling apart. The first cracks appeared almost immediately. By the next morning, local business publications were already reporting on the revelations. Reporters requested interviews. Board members demanded emergency meetings. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions. And for the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore no longer dictated the conversation. The truth did. I watched most of it from a distance, not because I wasn't interested, because I was tired, emotionally tired. The previous weeks had consumed so much energy that all I wanted was peace. Yet peace wasn't possible. Not yet. The consequences were only beginning. 3 days after the event, Daniel called. His voice carried a level of satisfaction I rarely heard. Things are moving quickly. I sat down at my kitchen table. How quickly? Daniel laughed softly. Faster than Richard expected. That didn't surprise me. Men like Richard spend years believing they're untouchable. When accountability finally arrives, it often arrives all at once. Daniel continued. Several board members have already requested independent reviews. I nodded. Good. There's more. I waited. Some of Richard's longtime business partners are distancing themselves. That surprised me less than it should have. Loyalty is often easy when success is guaranteed. Much harder when risk appears. What about the ownership records? They've been verified. I closed my eyes briefly. For years, those records had remained hidden. Now they were finally being acknowledged. recognized, validated. It felt strange, not because I cared about the financial implications, but because it meant Thomas had been telling the truth all along. His warnings, his concerns, his fears, none of them had been imagined. He had seen something dangerous long before anyone else, and now the world was finally catching up. Later that afternoon, Victor Reynolds visited. We sat on my back porch, drinking coffee. The autumn air had turned cooler. Leaves drifted across the yard. For a while, neither of us spoke. Eventually, Victor broke the silence. "You know what's ironic?" I smiled faintly. "What?" "Richard spent years trying to look powerful." I laughed softly.
That's true." Victor shook his head. "The truly powerful people never need to prove it."
His words stayed with me. Because he was right. Richard's entire identity had been built around appearances, status, influence, recognition. Thomas had been the opposite. Thomas never cared whether people knew what he accomplished. He only cared that the work mattered. The difference between those two men had shaped everything that followed. Victor eventually left. But before he did, he shared one final update. "Several people are preparing to cooperate." I frowned. "Cooperate? Former employees? Former executives? People who stayed silent for years?" That caught my attention. "Why now?" Victor smiled sadly. "Because fear only lasts as long as power." The statement proved accurate. Over the following weeks, more information emerged. More records. More witnesses. More questions. Every new revelation made Richard's position weaker. And every new revelation seemed to confirm what Thomas had suspected years ago. Then, something happened that I never expected. Margaret Whitmore called me. At first, I considered ignoring the call. But curiosity won. When I answered, her voice sounded different. Smaller somehow, less confident. "Brenda," I remained cautious. "Margaret." A long silence followed. Then she spoke quietly. "I'm sorry." The words caught me completely off guard. For several seconds, I wasn't sure how to respond. Margaret continued. "I should have treated you better." I stared out the kitchen window, thinking, remembering the subtle insults, the fake smiles, the dismissive comments. Part of me wanted to be angry. Instead, I felt tired. Just tired. "I appreciate that." Her voice trembled slightly. "I didn't know everything. I believed her, at least partly. Margaret may have ignored certain truths. But I genuinely doubted she understood the full picture. Very few people did." Before ending the call, she said something unexpected. "Richard isn't handling this well." I almost laughed. That was the understatement of the century. "What does that mean?" Another pause. Then she answered, "He's scared." For years, I had imagined Richard as fearless, confident, untouchable. The idea of him being frightened felt strange, yet somehow satisfying. Not because I enjoyed his suffering. Because fear meant accountability, and accountability was long overdue. A week later, the most surprising development arrived. Ethan lost his position, not completely, not permanently, But the promotion Richard had promised him disappeared. Board members postponed leadership decisions. Pending reviews. Pending investigations. Pending clarity. Everything became pending. The future Ethan thought was guaranteed suddenly wasn't guaranteed anymore. I learned this through Olivia. She arrived at my house one afternoon without warning. The moment I opened the door, I knew something had changed. Her eyes were red. She looked exhausted, heartbroken. "Can I come in?" "Of course." We sat together in the living room. For a while, she simply stared at the floor. Then she finally spoke. "I don't know who my father is anymore." The pain in her voice was genuine and heartbreaking. Because unlike Ethan, Olivia had never intentionally chosen greed. She had simply trusted the wrong person. "Her father!" I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I'm sorry." Tears filled her eyes. "He lied to everyone." I didn't answer. There wasn't much to say. Some truths hurt too deeply for easy comfort. Eventually, she asked a question. "Do you hate him?" I knew exactly who she meant. "Richard." I thought carefully before answering. "No." She looked surprised. I continued. "Hating someone gives them too much power." The room became quiet. "I don't hate your father." "What do you feel?" I considered the question, then answered honestly. "I feel disappointed, because disappointment was the truth, not just in Richard, in Ethan, in myself, in everything that had happened." Olivia wiped away a tear. Then she nodded slowly, as though understanding something important. When she left, I found myself thinking about the strange path life takes. A few months earlier, the Whitmores had treated me like I didn't belong in their world. Now that world was collapsing, and the people inside it were searching for answers, searching for stability, searching for truth. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore's empire continued shrinking. Board seats disappeared. Influence weakened. Partnerships dissolved. The consequences kept coming, one after another, like dominoes falling. Yet despite everything, I felt no desire for revenge. That surprised even me. I had every reason to be angry, every reason to celebrate his downfall, and yet I couldn't, because revenge would never give me what I truly wanted. It would never restore lost years, never erase painful memories, never bring Thomas back, never return the son I once knew. What I wanted wasn't revenge, it was honesty. And now, honesty was finally winning. The most important battle, however, still remained. Because Richard Whitmore wasn't the person who broke my heart. Ethan was. And sooner or later, my son would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to become. A man shaped by power, or a man shaped by character. The collapse of Richard's empire had begun. But Ethan's real test was only just beginning. The first time Ethan came to apologize, I wasn't home. I found a note tucked beneath my front door when I returned from grocery shopping. It was simple, only one sentence. "Mom, please let me explain." No signature, no lengthy excuses, no dramatic declarations, Just that, for several minutes. I stood in my kitchen staring at the note. Part of me wanted to call him immediately. Part of me wanted to throw it away. Neither reaction felt right. So I placed it inside a drawer and continued with my day. 2 days later, he came in person. This time, I opened the door and found him standing on the porch. Alone. No Olivia. No Richard. No expensive suit. No polished corporate image. Just Ethan. My son. For the first time in months, he looked vulnerable and strangely young. Almost like the little boy who used to wait for me by the front window whenever I worked late. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. The same question he had asked before. But this time, everything felt different. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly, nervously. The silence between us felt heavy. Neither of us knew where to begin. Eventually, we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I had helped him with homework. The same table where we celebrated birthdays. The same table where he had recently asked me to sign away my rights. The memory still hurt. But I pushed it aside. For now. Ethan looked around the room. His eyes settled on the old photographs hanging near the hallway. Pictures of family vacations. School events. Christmas mornings. Moments from a different life. A better life. "Finally," he spoke. "I've been an idiot." The blunt honesty surprised me. I said nothing. He continued. "For a long time, Satsam. Still, I remained silent. Not because I wanted to punish him, because I wanted him to keep talking. This wasn't about what I needed to say. It was about what he needed to understand." Ethan stared down at his hands. I thought I was building something." His voice cracked slightly. "A future." I listened quietly. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. A painful smile crossed his face. "The funny part is that I actually believed it." His words sounded genuine. Not rehearsed, not strategic, genuine. For the first time in months, I saw remorse instead of defensiveness. And that mattered a lot. Ethan took a deep breath. "When Richard started mentoring me, it felt incredible." He shook his head. "I'd never had someone like that." The statement stung, not because it was cruel, because there was truth inside it. Thomas died when Ethan was young, and despite my best efforts, there were things I couldn't provide. Certain kinds of guidance, certain experiences, certain perspectives. Richard had stepped into that gap and slowly filled it. Not as a father, but as an influence, a powerful one, Ethan continued. "He made me feel important." I nodded slowly. "I know. He talked about success constantly." Another pause. "He talked about winning." The bitterness in Ethan's voice surprised me. Then he laughed softly. A sad laugh. "The problem is that eventually I started believing that winning was all that mattered." The room grew quiet. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then Ethan looked directly at me. and asked the question he had probably been avoiding. How long have I been hurting you? The words nearly broke my heart. Because they came too late. Far too late. But at least they came. I considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. Longer than you realize. His eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Not performative tears. Real ones. The kind people try unsuccessfully to hide. I'm sorry. I believed him. That was the hardest part. I believed him. Because the Ethan sitting across from me now wasn't the same man who had carried Richard's paperwork into my kitchen. Something had changed. The collapse of Richard's empire had forced him to see himself clearly. And sometimes, clarity hurts more than punishment. For nearly an hour we talked. Really talked. For the first time in years. No distractions. No excuses. No interruptions. Just honesty. He admitted how much he had enjoyed the status, the attention, the opportunities, the feeling of belonging in powerful circles. Then he admitted something even harder. Sometimes I was embarrassed. The confession hung in the air. Painful. Uncomfortable. Necessary. I remained silent. Ethan looked away. I hate saying that, but it's true. He swallowed hard. When Richard made comments about where we came from, his voice trailed off. I should have defended you. I nodded. Yes. His eyes closed briefly. I know. The room became quiet again. Then I asked a question. One I had been carrying for months. When Richard asked you to choose, if he... Ethan immediately knew what I meant. The study, the documents, the future, the bargain. He lowered his head. I chose wrong, simple, direct, honest. The answer somehow hurt less than I expected, because there was no justification attached. No excuses, no attempt to rewrite history. Just truth, and truth matters. Eventually, Ethan looked back up. Do you know what the worst part is? I waited. He laughed bitterly. I thought I was choosing strength. The sadness in his voice was overwhelming. But I was actually choosing weakness. I didn't respond. Because he was finally teaching himself the lesson I could never force him to learn. A lesson about character. About integrity. About who we become when nobody is watching. The conversation continued late into the afternoon. At one point, Ethan asked something I had been expecting. Can you forgive me? The question lingered between us. Heavy, important, complicated. I looked at my son carefully. Really looked at him. The answer wasn't simple. Because forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. Many people confuse them. I don't. Finally, I spoke. I forgave you a long time ago. His eyes widened. What? I smiled sadly. The day you chose Richard? Confusion crossed his face. I continued. Holding on to anger would have destroyed me. The room became silent. I forgave you because I needed peace. Tears rolled down his cheeks. But... The single word carried enormous weight. I nodded. Yes, but the truth deserved honesty. I forgive you. Another pause. But things can't go back to the way they were. Pain flashed across his face. I hated causing it. But false hope would be crueler. Trust takes years to build, moments to break, and time to repair. A lot of time. Ethan slowly nodded, as though he already knew, as though part of him expected that answer. Then he asked one final question. Though, the inheritance. There it was. The topic everyone secretly wondered about. The ownership interests. The assets. The future. I met his eyes. What about it? He hesitated, then shook his head. Never mind. The answer surprised me, because for the first time, he wasn't asking what he would receive. He wasn't asking what belonged to him. He wasn't asking about money at all. Instead, he stood and walked toward the door. Then he stopped. Mom. Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. I don't deserve another chance. The pain in those words felt genuine. But I hope I can earn one. Then he left. I remained standing in the doorway long after he drove away, watching the empty street, thinking, remembering, hoping, because for the first time in a very long time, I saw a glimpse of the boy I had raised. Not fully returned. Not yet, but visible. And sometimes healing begins exactly there, not with perfection. Not with instant reconciliation, but with honesty. For months, Ethan had chosen money over family, status over loyalty, ambition over character. Now he finally understood the cost. And that understanding would shape everything that came next. A month after my conversation with Ethan, I found myself sitting once again in Daniel Coleman's office. But this meeting felt very different from the others. The investigations were largely complete. The ownership disputes had been resolved. The legal battles were winding down. For the first time in a long while, we weren't discussing the past. We were discussing the future. Daniel sat across from me, reviewing several documents. When he finished reading, he removed his glasses and smiled. Are you absolutely certain? I looked down at the papers in front of me. Then I smiled. More certain than I've been about anything in years. Daniel nodded. I thought you might say that. For most of my life, I had viewed money as a tool, not a goal, not a source of identity, just a tool, useful, necessary, but never the most important thing. That belief had only grown stronger during the previous year. After everything that happened with Richard, after everything that happened with Ethan, I understood something more clearly than ever before. Money reveals character. It doesn't create it. The wealthy can be generous or selfish. The poor can be generous or selfish. The money itself isn't the issue. The heart behind it is. That realization influenced every decision I was about to make. Daniel slid another document across the desk. Last chance to change your mind? I laughed softly. I am not changing my mind. The document outlined the creation of a charitable foundation. Something I had spent weeks planning, something that felt deeply personal. For years, I had met women whose stories resembled mine. Widows, single mothers, older women abandoned by family members, women who spent decades sacrificing for others only to be forgotten later. Some struggled financially, others struggled emotionally. Many struggled with both. I wanted to help them, not because I saw myself as a hero, because I understood their pain. The Brenda Matthews Foundation officially became reality that afternoon. Its mission was simple: support older women facing abandonment, financial hardship, and family isolation. Provide emergency assistance, housing support, legal resources, community programs, and most importantly, dignity. The foundation wouldn't solve every problem, but it could help, and helping mattered. After we finalized the paperwork, Daniel smiled. Thomas would be proud. Those words nearly brought tears to my eyes. Because despite everything that had happened, Thomas remained at the center of this story. His integrity, his values, his vision. In many ways, the foundation felt like a continuation of everything he believed in. Not an act of revenge, an act of purpose. A few weeks later, we held a small launch event. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just community leaders, local organizations, volunteers, and supporters, the kind of people Richard Whitmore would never have invited to one of his galas. And yet, I found their company infinitely more valuable. These people genuinely cared. That made all the difference. As guests arrived, I noticed a familiar face near the entrance. Ethan. For a brief moment, I wasn't sure whether he would come. Then our eyes met. He smiled nervously. The smile reminded me of the shy little boy who used to hide behind my legs during school events. I smiled back. Glad you came. I wouldn't have missed it. The sincerity in his voice touched me. Over the previous month, Ethan had been changing. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Real change rarely works that way. Instead, it happened through small choices, consistent choices, intentional choices. He began volunteering, helping local community organizations, mentoring teenagers, supporting programs for struggling families, not because anyone required him to, because he wanted to. For the first time in years, I saw him pursuing purpose instead of status. And that gave me hope. A little later, Olivia arrived as well. She hugged me warmly. Our relationship had improved significantly. The collapse of Richard's carefully constructed image had forced many difficult conversations within their family. Painful conversations, necessary conversations. Eventually, Olivia separated herself from much of her father's influence. She remained his daughter, but she no longer accepted everything he said without question. That growth impressed me. Not everyone has the courage to challenge the people they love. Olivia did. During the event, several speakers shared stories. Stories about resilience, community, second chances. I listened quietly, feeling grateful, not for the money, not for the ownership interests, not for the legal victories, for perspective. The kind of perspective suffering sometimes provides. Later that evening, Ethan approached me. We stood near a display describing the Foundation's mission. For a while, we simply looked at it together. Then he spoke, I've been thinking about Dad. The comment surprised me.
Yeah?
He nodded. A lot. I smiled softly. He'd like that. A brief silence followed. Then Ethan laughed quietly.
You know what's funny?
What?
For years, I thought success meant becoming someone important.
I waited. He shook his head. I never realized Dad already was. The words hit me hard. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. Thomas never appeared on magazine covers. Never sought recognition. Never chased status. Yet the impact he left behind remained powerful decades later. That's real success. Not wealth, legacy, character, love, the things that endure. A few moments later, Ethan asked a question. One I had expected eventually. The inheritance. I looked at him carefully. This time his tone sounded different. No entitlement, no expectation, just curiosity. What about it? He shrugged. I know you've been updating things. I smiled.
Yes, that was true.
After everything that happened, Daniel and I had revised my estate plans. Extensively. The foundation would receive the majority of my assets. That decision never felt difficult, not even once. Because I knew exactly what I wanted my legacy to be. Helping people. Not accumulating things. Ethan nodded slowly, then surprised me. I think that's the right decision. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. He smiled, a genuine smile. The old version of me would have been disappointed. I laughed softly.
The old version?
He nodded. I don't like that version very much anymore. Neither did I. But hearing him say it meant more than he realized. Because true growth begins when people stop defending their worst choices and start learning from them instead. I placed a hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you. His eyes widened slightly. The words clearly caught him off guard. Perhaps because he felt he didn't deserve them. Perhaps because he hadn't heard them in a while. Either way, emotion filled his expression immediately. Thanks, Mom. The moment felt simple, small, quiet, and yet it meant everything. Because healing rarely happens through grand gestures. It happens through moments like that. Moments where people choose honesty, choose humility, choose love. As the evening ended and guests began leaving, I stood alone for a few minutes, watching, reflecting, thinking. The foundation had been launched. The future felt brighter. The wounds weren't completely healed. Maybe some never would be. But they were healing, and that was enough. Before leaving, I glanced toward a framed photograph displayed near the entrance. A photograph of Thomas. Beneath it sat a simple quote, one of his favorites. Character is what remains when everything else is taken away. I smiled. Because after everything that had happened, I finally understood exactly what those words meant. And soon, I would ensure that understanding shaped the legacy I left behind. It has been almost 3 years since the night my son chose his wealthy father-in-law over me. 3 years since Daniel Coleman walked into that ballroom. 3 years since Richard Whitmore's carefully constructed world began to collapse.
Sometimes people ask me if I would relive those events differently if given the chance. My answer is always the same. No, not because the experience wasn't painful. It was not because I enjoyed watching relationships break. I didn't. And certainly not because I enjoyed seeing Ethan suffer. A mother's heart doesn't work that way. The reason I wouldn't change anything is simple. The truth eventually gave all of us something we desperately needed. A chance to become better people. Including me. Today, my life looks very different than it did before all of this began. Not because of money. Not because of ownership interests. Not because of legal victories. Because of peace. For the first time in many years. I wake up each morning without carrying bitterness. Without carrying resentment. Without carrying the burden of pretending everything is fine when it isn't. That freedom is worth more than any inheritance. The Brenda Matthews Foundation has grown far beyond what I imagined possible. What began as a small local initiative now serves women across multiple communities. Every month, I meet women whose stories remind me why this work matters. Widows abandoned by family. Grandmothers raising grandchildren alone. Women who spent decades sacrificing for others only to be forgotten when they became inconvenient. Whenever I sit with them, I recognize something familiar. Pain. Loneliness. Disappointment. But I also recognize something else. Strength. The kind of strength people rarely notice. The kind of strength that quietly survives impossible circumstances. The kind of strength I once saw in my own reflection. Helping those women has helped me heal too. In many ways, they saved me as much as I helped them. As for Richard Whitmore, his life changed dramatically. Most of his influence disappeared. Several business ventures were restructured. Many longtime associates moved on. The reputation he spent decades building never fully recovered. I rarely think about him now, not because I forgot, because he no longer occupies space in my heart. Some people imagine healing means winning, defeating someone, watching them fail. I've learned something different. Healing begins when another person's choices stop controlling your emotions. Richard no longer controls mine. And that feels like freedom. Margaret eventually moved into a smaller home near her sister. We speak occasionally, not often, but enough. There is sadness in her voice these days. Regret, too. Yet, I also hear relief. Sometimes, the collapse of an illusion creates room for honesty. I think that's what happened to her. Olivia remained involved with the foundation. That surprised many people, but not me. She possesses a quiet kindness that survived everything her family went through. Over the years, she and I developed a relationship that feels more authentic than anything we shared before. Not based on appearances, not based on expectations, just mutual respect. And then there is Ethan. The person many people ask about first. The person whose choices began this entire journey. If I'm honest, rebuilding our relationship took far longer than either of us expected. Trust is like a house. You can spend years building it. A single storm can damage it. And repairs take time, a lot of time. For months after our reconciliation, Ethan continued showing up, not with speeches, not with promises, with actions, consistent actions. He volunteered, mentored young people, helped at community programs, supported foundation projects. Sometimes he spent entire weekends painting community centers or delivering supplies. Nobody asked him to do those things. Nobody rewarded him. He simply did them. At first, I wondered whether guilt motivated him. Maybe it did. But over time, something changed. The work stopped being about redemption. It became part of who he was. One afternoon last spring, we were driving back from a foundation event together. The conversation drifted toward childhood memories. We laughed about old stories, shared memories, the kind of easy conversation we hadn't enjoyed in years. Then Ethan suddenly said something that stayed with me. I spent so much time trying to become successful that I forgot who taught me what success actually means. I looked at him. He smiled, a genuine smile, the kind I hadn't seen since he was young. And in that moment, I realized something important. The son I thought I had lost forever wasn't gone. He had simply lost his way. Now he was finding his way back. Not to the past. The past cannot be recreated, but towards something better, something wiser, something more honest. Recently, Daniel invited Ethan and me to lunch. The three of us sat together discussing foundation projects and future plans. At one point, Daniel excused himself briefly. As soon as he walked away, Ethan looked at me. Then he laughed. "What?" I asked. He shook his head. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "How different everything could have been." The statement hung in the air. I understood exactly what he meant. A different choice, a different decision, a different path. And perhaps none of the pain would have happened. Or perhaps something even worse would have happened. We'll never know. Life doesn't allow us to compare alternate endings. We only get one story, Kim, one path, one chance to learn. Eventually, Ethan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. A simple gesture, yet one that meant everything. Because years earlier, he had chosen wealth over family, status over loyalty, approval over truth. Now he understood what those choices cost. And more importantly, he understood what truly matters. A few weeks ago, I updated my estate documents one final time. The foundation remains the primary beneficiary. That decision hasn't changed. Neither has the condition attached to Ethan's portion. Daniel laughed when he reviewed it. "You know, most people would just leave money." I smiled. "Money isn't the lesson. The condition is simple. If Ethan wishes to receive his portion someday, he must continue serving others. Not for a month, not for a year, for the rest of his life. Because the greatest inheritance Thomas ever left wasn't ownership. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't business interests. It was character. And character only survives when we practice it. Sometimes I sit on my back porch in the evening and think about everything that happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the courtroom meetings, the revelations, the apologies, the healing, all of it. Then I look at the sunset, and I remember something Thomas used to say. The truth takes longer, but it travels farther. He was right. The truth took years to emerge. But when it finally arrived, it changed everything. Not because it made us richer, because it made us honest. And in the end, honesty gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. My peace.
my dignity, and eventually, my son.
When I look back on this journey, the greatest lesson isn't about money, inheritance, or business ownership. It's about the choices we make when our values are tested. Many people believe betrayal begins with one terrible decision. In reality, it often begins with small compromises. A moment of silence when we should speak. A choice to ignore something we know is wrong. A willingness to trade character for convenience. Ethan didn't become the different person overnight. He slowly allowed ambition to replace gratitude. Like many of us, he convinced himself that success justified certain sacrifices. But eventually, he learned what all of us must learn. No amount of wealth can replace integrity. And no opportunity is worth losing the people who truly love you. I also learned that forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the pain never happened. It doesn't mean trusting someone immediately. It simply means refusing to let bitterness control your future. Most importantly, I learned that dignity matters. No matter how others treat you, never allow anyone to define your worth, not by your income, not by your status, not by your age. Your value comes from who you are, not what you own. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between family and success? Have you ever forgiven someone who deeply hurt you? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoyed this journey, please like, subscribe, and join our community. There are many more stories ahead, and I'd be honored to share them with you.